Welcome to Nutrition Unpacked, our myth-busting show, where we take popular nutrition claims, viral wellness trends, and stubborn misinformation and unpack them with research. We are your hosts,
Brenda Davis, and I'm a registered dietitian with about 40 years experience in the plant-based world and just completed my 14th book. Very passionate about getting things right. So very happy to be here.
and I'm Chantal Di Donato, a nutritionist and naturopath, also vegan for about 15 years, and really on a mission to make sure that we share information that is not just hot topics online. We are on a mission to share evidence, nuisance, and practical takeaways. In each episode, we will pick a headline or a hot topic like protein, seed oils, sugar, supplements, fasting, you name it. And ourselves, when we are together or with amazing guests, we are going to share evidence, science, and takeaways that you can be practically implementing in your life so that you don't have to have any fear, shame, or fall for any fads. So if you're tired of nutrition noise and want grounded, empowered information, you are in the right place. Welcome everyone to our first episode of Nutrition Unpacked. How are you, Brenda?
I am really well and excited about this topic because I am so passionate about it. So thanks so much for organizing this, and we'll have fun.
Yes, we will. I'm really happy that we can do this. And I think before we start the episode and we go into today's first topic, which is going to be the dietary guidelines of the US, which are impacting the whole world, as we discussed also on another episode of my podcast, The Wellness Woman. I want to just mention, so we're starting this project together, but you're a very busy woman and you're also launching your new book, 14th book right now. So you will be traveling a lot and unfortunately can't be here for all the episodes. But you are the backbone of this program because together we have reviewed the episode, the information that we see online. We bounce them back and forth to see what is really worth discussing and bringing the science forward with. And also you are an advisor on who we should invite as speakers here, because we want to make sure that every information here is not biased, or I mean we all have bias, but that is actually really scientific, because we don't want to add to the noise online, right?
That's for sure.
Cool. So today's episode is this, it's like a viral trend, really. The USD dietary guidelines. We are in shock, you and I, about what has come out of this, the situation, because we always feel like, obviously with the government, they always have people that come on to truly give scientific evidence as to why we should follow some the guidelines, especially when it goes to the general population. So we're looking at population health, right? We're not just looking at a person's own issues. It's not personalized nutrition. And we have evidence that we need more fiber in our diets. We have evidence that we need more plants in general for the antioxidants, any other micronutrient. And this guideline in the US has just gone haywire, firing in a way all the information and advice given by the advisory committee, and then deciding to bring in people that are heavily tied to industry to push a very carnivore friendly approach. So you give a little bit
and for me it is disturbing. I think these guidelines really represent one of the greatest shifts in the US nutrition policy in decades. And the updated recommendations essentially elevate red meat, full fat dairy, animal-based fats like beef tallow and butter, well, demoting, if you will, carbohydrate-rich foods such as whole grains, and even suggesting carbohydrate restriction as a strategy for chronic disease management. And it's not a minor reframing. This is a fundamental shift in emphasis, and it stands in really direct contrast to decades of high-quality evidence from randomized control trials and large prospective cohort studies demonstrating that dietary patterns centered on minimally processed plant foods, and we're talking fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains, nuts and seeds, are very consistently associated with a lower risk of all-cause mortality and chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, really the biggest killers in the world. And then it goes on, there's this we've known for a long time that there's a causal relationship between saturated fat intake, particularly from red and processed meat and high-fat dairy, and elevated LDL cholesterol. And this isn't controversial at all within cardiometabolic science. It's one of the most rigorously established pathways in preventive cardiology. And the relative de-emphasis on this body of evidence in the current guidelines is not just curious. It has big consequences for public health. And then, of course, I would say the concern isn't just limited to the recommendations themselves. It really extends to the process, how these recommendations actually came about. So for this cycle of the recommendations, and the recommendations are 5-year recommendations. So this cycle is 2025 to 2030. And for this cycle, 20 independent scientists spent 22 months conducting systematic reviews, evaluating randomized trials, cohort studies, meta-analyses, umbrella reviews, and they produced a 400-page plus scientific report. And their work was transparent, publicly deliberated. It was methodology. I would say, from a methodology standpoint, it was rigorous. And yet the final policy document diverges so significantly from this scientific report. And I don't have all of the information, but it appears that there was an additional scientific foundation document that informed the final guidelines. But its authorship, its vetting, its methods, its transparency are really not clearly documented, or as the advisory committee's work is. And to me, in public health, transparency is not something that is optional. When we try to synthesize scientific results and develop policy for the public, the process needs to be really transparent. And I think, this document really erodes the trust of the public. And again, policy, evolution is expected. I mean, we expect change in nutrition science, but this is not change. This is regression. When national dietary guidance appears to move away from the strongest, most consistent body of evidence supporting plant-forward dietary patterns for chronic disease prevention, we have to ask some difficult questions. And as a Canadian, I come from a country whose most recent dietary guidelines, our 2019 guidelines, moved decisively towards plant-forward patterns based on a very transparent review of the evidence. And, there are a lot of nations globally that look to the US as a reference point. And that makes this shift not merely domestic policy, but international signal. And if the weight of evidence has genuinely changed, that needs to be demonstrated clearly. And if it has not, then the interpretation of the evidence deserves very rigorous scrutiny. So in this episode, I would like to pick apart the guidelines page by page, piece by piece, and really examine this what has come out, this 9-page dietary guidelines for Americans that resulted from all of
Perfect. And
this.
what we'll do is that we make sure that for everything that we tear apart and then evaluate, we also give the science so that you know where the science stands versus the guidelines, for the recommendations versus actually what reality tells us from randomized
Yes,
control studies. The other thing I'd like to
absolutely.
add is you mentioned something really important. People that were on the committee spent 22 months working on the initial 400 pages document. um, we're very committed and we're very scrutinized heavily. For example, Professor Gardner from Stanford was one of them, and he actually shared on another podcast that they had to fill very rigorous forms to even put a disclaimer if they were paid by any industry at all, if they were at speaking events, and a cost would be covered. So we're not talking about just conflict of interest in the sense that, the pharmaceutical company is paying for your holidays in Bahamas or Hawaii. That's not actually it. Like, they had to disclaim, even if there was a taxi fare being paid between the airport and the convention hall where they were invited to talk. So very, very rigorous, yeah. But at the end, the people that actually sat with Robert Kennedy Jr., they are paid by industry, not just invited to conferences and expenses are paid off or whatever. This is like people that are actually given funding. So it's surprising, but also very hypocritical to give the 22 the 20 the scientists that were on the board discussing with each other, sharing every single detail, even about any expenses covered by industry, and then having people that are paid by industry that made the decisions in the end.
Yeah, it's as I said, I think the word that comes to my mind is just disturbing. It really is, and it's really unjustifiable, and it needs to be challenged at so many levels.
Yeah. All right, let's start with the document then. Take it away.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess Chantal, if you could show an image of the dietary guidelines, the actual image of the inverted pyramid, that would be helpful as I talk about that first, and then we'll go line by line
Perfect. Let's get it.
through things. So, basically when you do a pyramid, it's kind of like a hierarchy. And in this particular hierarchy, what you'll notice is that there's a line at the top of the pyramid, and then there's one other line near the bottom of the pyramid. And in where the bulk of foods rest, at the very top, you see chicken and cheese on that very first plane. Beside the chicken is broccoli, peas, and carrots. And then, so it's basically red meat, hamburger, cheese, some sort of poultry, turkey or chicken, and whole milk at the very top on one side, and then on the other side is vegetables. And then as you go down, there's a piece of salmon, some yogurt, eggs, shrimp, canned tuna, it looks like yogurt. And then moving to the right on the other side, you've got olive oil, and underneath olive oil is half of an avocado, and then there's 1.5 apple pieces, and this is where you've got more of the fruit. So it looks like it may be a mango and some berries and an orange, grapes, a banana, and then you see a few plant foods on the bottom left of that portion. And so there's 2 walnuts, there's 1 almond, there's a peanut in the shell with 2 peanuts out of the shell. And then to the left, and I have no idea why they did this, but there is a bowl that's filled with white rice and a few kidney beans on top. And I just don't understand. This is called protein, dairy, and healthy fats. And so I'm not sure why the bowl of white rice is there. I would think a bowl of beans or lentils or a chili or something like that would have been in a more appropriate image there. And so, protein, while they definitely are favoring meat, poultry, fish, and then dairy, definitely full fat dairy. And then healthy fats, the only fats actually pictured in this image are butter and olive oil. And then there's this line below which is whole grains, which kind of is demoting whole grains. They're below this line at the very bottom of the image. And there are two whole grains shown. One is oatmeal and one is sort of looks like maybe sourdough bread. I think these are supposed to be, it's supposed to be a whole grain bread, but it's a little whitish for my liking. But anyway, that's basically what you see in the image, which is pretty much the opposite of the emphasis, where the emphasis lay before that. So, and do you want to make any more comments about the image, Chantal?
Yeah, I'd like to actually point out something, and I wonder if this is why they put that bowl of rice with the beans. We had this very old-fashioned understanding that we had to do complementing to get enough protein for a vegan diet. We know this, the people that have shared these guidelines are not vegetarian or vegan friendly. And they actually, in the document, even have insinuated that a vegan diet is short of amino acids and other nutrients. And I think that this was purposely put there to show that you can't get enough amino acids from a single food. In fact, there's not even like a bit of tofu up here. And they say that, they probably will show this as in you need to complement rice and beans, which was always the understanding, but has been debunked since a long time now. And I think that's why they put it there.
Oh, that is such a thought. I mean, I think you're very perceptive, and I think you're right. That didn't occur to me. I just thought that is just strange why they put a big bowl of white rice with a few beans on top. But that's probably why, because they're extremely outdated in their views on protein. So think about, let's first of all, let's compare the inverted pyramid to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommendations. And the contrast is really sharp. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee emphasized healthy dietary patterns built around vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. They recommended limited intake of saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars, a shift away from red and processed meat towards plant-based proteins, and the importance of health equity, recognizing that dietary guidance must support a diverse range of cultural traditions and accessible food choices for the public. And in sharp contrast to that, the new inverted pyramid really elevates red meat, full-fat dairy, and butter, all major sources of saturated fat, giving them really a central role. They place grains and legumes lower. Certainly, legumes are way below red meat, poultry, fish, all of the animal products, as if they're optional or less favorable. And it omits any mention of health equity, accessibility, sustainability, and then they basically include no clear emphasis on limiting saturated fat in practice, despite saying it should be 10%. So those are some of the things that I think are really stark contrast between the Dietary Advisory Guidelines Committee and the final document. So now let's walk through the guide. And so page by page. So page 1, there are let's see, I think there's 4 sections on page 1. I need to look at the page. Okay, yeah. So page 1, the first section says, I'm looking over at it. I'm going to pull it over here. Eat the right amount for you. The second section is prioritize protein foods at every meal. The third is to consume dairy, and the fourth is just labeled gut health. And so the very first section is just about eat the right amount for you. And there's no major concerns. It just basically is stating energy balance guidance that is pretty consistent with longstanding recommendations. So no issue there. The second part is on protein, and the title is Prioritize Protein Foods at Every Meal. And bullet number 1 says prioritize high quality nutrient dense protein foods as part of a healthy dietary pattern. I mean, this is fine, but what are they meaning by high quality? And they answer that question in bullet number 2. So bullet number 2 says consume a variety of protein foods from animal sources, including eggs, poultry, seafood, and red meat, as well as a variety of plant-sourced protein foods, including beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, and soy. So you can see this bullet number 2 basically leans very heavily towards animal sources, despite the fact that Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommends prioritizing plant-based protein and even suggested reordering the protein foods group to list beans, peas, and lentils first, followed by nuts, seeds, soy, seafood, then red meat, poultry, and eggs. So why? Well, the reason is really simple. Why the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, that's basing their recommendations on science, on evidence. We have really strong evidence that high intake of red and processed meat is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and metabolic disorders. We have strong evidence that replacing animal protein with plant protein is associated with lower all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. And we have good evidence that higher plant-to-animal ratios correlate with reduced risk of heart disease and metabolic disease. And we even have, if you look at specific studies, we have a 2020 study on animal versus plant protein from the National Institutes of Health, with following over 416,000 individuals, and followed them for about 16 years. And what they looked at was what would happen if we replace 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein. And what they found, and just to put this in context, 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet is 60 calories. So 60 calories is less than one large egg. It's close to an ounce or an ounce and a half of processed meat. So it's not a lot of food. So replacing that amount of food with 60 calories worth of legumes, for example, reduces overall mortality by 10%. If what we replace is eggs, it's over 20%. If it's red meat, it's 13 to 15%. If it's dairy, it's about 8%. If it's white meat, it's lower, about 2 to 5%. There was another study from 2016 that specifically looked at replacing animal products with plant foods. And again, it was 3% of calories. And they looked specifically at processed meat. And I think it was 34% risk reduction when what we replaced was processed meat. So, and then there was a huge umbrella review of over 40 meta-analyses in 2023 that found for every additional 100 gram serving of red meat consumed, we increase our risk of type 2 diabetes 17%, of heart disease 15%, of hypertension 14%, of stroke 12%, and for every additional 50 grams, or this is 1 3/4 ounce serving of processed meat, type 2 diabetes risk increased 37%, heart disease 27%, stroke 17%, and all-cause mortality 15%. And so the evidence against red and processed meat is really, really strong. Protein source matters profoundly for chronic disease risk, and plant protein sources are consistently associated with better long-term health outcomes. And then if we go down to bullet 3, swap deep fried cooking methods with baked, broiled, roasted, stir-fried, or grilled cooking methods. And I think it's great to suggest swapping deep fried foods for, baked, broiled, roasted, or stir-fried foods. But I thought it was interesting that they didn't mention the safest method of cooking, which is a moist cooking method, steaming, stewing, water sauteing. These moist cooking methods produce far fewer products of oxidation. And I think that was an omission that should have been considered. And then bullet 4, so there's 2 more bullets in this section about protein. And bullet 4 says, consume meat with no or limited added sugars, refined carbohydrates, or starches, or chemical additives. If preferred, flavor with salt, spice, and herbs. Jaw-dropping. I mean, it's reasonable to encourage limiting things like breaded meat, sugary sauces, processed meats with that are high in salt and additives. But broadening the restriction to refined carbohydrates and starches implies, don't add any cornstarch to thicken your stew. Don't put your stir fry on white rice. And this is a very traditional Asian way of eating, is to eat the stir fry often on rice, which is often white rice. It means, the traditional Mediterranean dishes that might serve a meat sauce on a pasta. Well, that's no longer, what do you put your meat sauce on? It's not carbohydrates. And then, no flour tortillas. It just, to me, seems a bit of an overreach. And while the evidence clearly supports increasing whole grains and fiber intake and replacing refined grains with whole grains when feasible, refined grains are not metabolically equivalent to ultra-processed snack foods. And I think we need to recognize that. White rice, refined grains, tortillas, those kinds of things can be, they're staples in many cultural dietary patterns. And those dietary patterns in many cases are associated with really good health outcomes, particularly when they're paired with patterns that are plant predominant, like Mediterranean or many Asian dietary patterns. I think it's important to recognize that chronic disease risk is driven primarily by overall dietary pattern. Fiber intake, fat quality, degree of inclusion of ultra-processed foods is important. Not whether a stew contains a little bit of cornstarch to thicken it, or whether a meal includes traditional rice or pasta. I think this, to me, when we're doing public health messaging, it works best when it emphasizes proportion and substitution rather than prohibition. And encouraging more whole grains is evidence-based, but broadly discouraging all refined grains without context risks oversimplifying both the science and the cultural reality of how people eat. So I think it's, they've overstepped there for sure. And then bullet number 5 says protein serving goals, 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. The evidence really doesn't clearly support a blanket recommendation of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day across the board. The RDA, it diverges so significantly from the RDA. The RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, and this is based on nitrogen balance studies and is considered sufficient for most healthy adults. That having been said, a lot of clinicians, myself included, think that we may do better with slightly higher protein intakes. And I I often recommend 1 gram per kilogram per day as a reasonable target for healthy plant-based adults, particularly when protein sources are less digestible. So most of your protein is coming from things like beans and lentils. Now, for older adults, I think there's very credible evidence to say intakes that are closer to 1 to 1.2 or 1.3 grams per kilogram per day may help mitigate some of the, issues or muscle loss that we see with and frailty and so on, and even bone loss that's associated with aging. So expert groups also recommend, closer to 1.5 grams per kilogram for people that have sarcopenia or chronic disease. But this is not a universal requirement for all adults, regardless of age or health status or activity level. So I think 1.2 to 1.6 is an amount that is very commonly, recommended among the sort of the low carb carnivore type paleo communities, but is I don't think necessary for everyone. So that's the section on protein. Do you have anything that you would like to add, Chantel, to that?
Yeah, I would just say when you do recommendations like this, to me, is also to get to a certain amount of grams of protein, for example, and especially emphasizing the amount of it coming from animal products. And then we will see this in the next paragraphs when we talk about fats, but it doesn't compute logically because we are trying to tell people to have a certain percentage of fat, yet we're telling them to get protein from sources that are higher in fat, and also to watch their calories. And people are just going to be so confused because everything kind of doesn't make sense, and people don't eat macronutrients. They eat food that contain different proportions of macronutrients. And so it's really important to think about that. And this is where the nuisance is completely lost in a document that should have that because it's official and governmental guidelines.
Absolutely. So now we've gone through part 1, which was eat the right amount for you. Part 2, which was protein. Part 3 is dairy. And there's only 2 bullets here. Bullet number 1 says, when consuming dairy, include full fat dairy with no added sugars. Dairy is an excellent source of protein, healthy fats, vitamins, and minerals. So, they describe dairy as being a great source of all of these nutrients with absolutely zero mention of the concerns about saturated fat in this food. And then bullet 2 states, dairy serving goals are 3 servings per day as part of a 2,000 calorie dietary pattern, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. So if you require fewer calories, you may need a little less dairy. If you require more, you need more. Recommending 3 servings of dairy a day assumes that dairy is a necessary component of a healthy dietary pattern. However, as we know, there is absolutely zero biological requirement for dairy. The nutrients dairy provides, protein, calcium, vitamin D, even potassium, can be obtained from other foods, including fortified plant beverages, legumes, leafy greens, nuts, seeds, all of these things. And it's important also to recognize that many populations globally and many cultural groups in the United States have historically consumed little or no dairy and maintain very good health outcomes. And we also need to recognize that lactose intolerance affects about 2/3 of the global population. To me, public health guidelines should be culturally inclusive and evidence-based. And while dairy can be part of a healthy diet, and I know people would debate that, but I think the evidence isn't strong to say you can't have any. For people that choose to consume dairy, if it's carefully chosen, it can be a part of a healthy diet, as it is in many blue zones and for Mediterranean diets and so forth. but presenting it as 3 servings a day are necessary, sort of as the default goal, risks implying necessity when none exists. And the advisory committee didn't elevate full-fat dairy as a preferred choice, nor did it present compelling evidence that high-fat dairy confers cardioprotective benefits compared with plant-based alternatives. And I think the evidence is pretty strong that dairy can increase risk of certain disease, and that when you replace dairy with soy, there are studies looking at replacing dairy with soy and reducing risk of things like breast cancer. And so we need to recognize that as well. So again, if you have additional comments there, Chantel, that would be great.
I do. So there's another document, and we will share all these documents, even though they are available on the realfood.gov website. But there is a document that is talking about daily servings. So let's say for a person that has 2,000 calories daily intake, they are recommended to take 3 servings of dairy, as we just mentioned. And when it comes to vegetables, then they're recommended 3 portions, 3 servings of vegetables, and 1.5 servings of fruit. And just the imbalance there, it, it makes you really wonder. Sorry, two pieces of fruit, 2 servings of fruit. How can you decrease? Because obviously they are now looking at calories, which we know is not the hallmark of a healthy lifestyle and diet. We want to have it as a guideline, but calories from different food will do different things from us. On top of it, people love to feel that they have an abundance of food in their plate. And now you will have to reduce things like vegetables and fruit to accommodate a higher calorie, higher fat food such as dairy on your plate, getting us to have only 3 servings of vegetables and 2 servings of fruit for a 2,000 calories daily diet, which is so off the mark, because we should be looking at least 10 servings of vegetables a day to get at least 30 grams of fiber every day. So it's really sad to see that they're actually pushing people away from getting enough fiber in their body, you know?
Yeah, and that actually brings us to part 4 of page 1, which is gut health. And so what they say here is your gut contains trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms called your microbiome. A healthy diet supports a well-balanced microbiome and healthy digestion. Highly processed foods can disrupt this balance, while vegetables, fruits, and fermented foods and high fiber foods support a diverse gut microbiome, which may be beneficial for health. And, here I think it's encouraging to see the microbiome acknowledged in the guidelines, and that they state fruits, vegetables, fermented foods, and high fiber foods promote or support microbial diversity. I think it's directionally quite correct. But one can't help but notice that legumes and whole grains, which are 2 of the most studied and impactful sources of prebiotic fiber, are not explicitly highlighted. And the strongest long-term, outcome data linking diet and health to a healthy gut microbiome are showing that fermentable fibers are really key, which is resistant starches, beta glucans, and other prebiotic compounds found most abundantly in beans, lentils, oats, barley, and other whole grains. So these are the fibers that fuel microbial fermentation and lead to the production of short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which plays a central role in health and metabolism. So fermented foods may contribute live microbes, but without adequate fiber intake from legumes and whole grains and fruits and vegetables and so forth, these microbes lack the substrate to thrive. So from a scientific standpoint, fiber diversity is functional. And I think it was an intentional and ridiculous omission to not mention the importance of legumes and whole grains. Any additional comments there, Chantal?
Yeah, I mean, this we'll discuss on an episode with to talk about the carnivore diet, because I had put a comment on Diary of a CEO, because he had invited a doctor whose name I don't remember right now, who is very much about carnivore keto diets. And my comment was exactly about, how this is actually not beneficial for our gut health. And of course, in the comments, I have the reply from someone saying that she has been, or he has been, carnivore for 11 years and is the healthiest. And I said, well, I'm very happy that this, diet that is basically an elimination diet served you. I don't know what he was eating before. But we know that scientifically speaking, our evidence shares that fiber is not an optional thing. And this person believes fiber is an optional thing because I think fiber has been so connected to going to the toilet, which of course your body will do even if if you're on a carnivore diet, because otherwise you're gonna die of poisoning. But and not probably as efficiently as you should be by eating a diet high in fiber, which means daily and not once, maybe twice or so. And and they don't understand that it's not just about the poo. It's not just fiber equals going to the toilet. Is fiber equals giving the microbiome the right amount of food to create these short chain fatty acids, which have a massive ripple effect on our health, cardiovascular, metabolic, and so on. So this is what is missing in the sharing online of these influencers.
Absolutely. And so let's move on to page 2, which covers vegetables, fruits, fats, and whole grains. And so the part 1 is eat vegetables and fruits throughout the day. Good job there. There's 6 bullets here. Number 1, eat a variety of colorful, nutrient-dense vegetables and fruits. Second bullet is eat whole vegetables and fruits in their original forms, wash thoroughly prior to eating, raw or cooking. Bullet 3 is frozen, dried, and canned vegetables or fruits with no or very limited added sugars can also be good options. And then 5 is if preferred flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. And 6 is 100% fruit or vegetable juice should be consumed in limited portions or diluted with water. It's interesting that they're telling us to flavor foods with salt, and they always list salt first, salt, spices, and herbs instead of spices, herbs, and a small amount of salt or something like that. But when we know salt is associated with some adverse health outcomes and we want to limit to some extent, and they do talk about limiting it later, but they place it fairly prominently when they're telling us to flavor foods. And then the final bullet is vegetables and fruits serving goals for a 2,000 calorie dietary pattern, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements, are 3 servings of vegetables and 2 servings of fruit. And so I think the section is, largely reasonable, encouraging variety, whole forms, limiting added sugars. I think aligns pretty well with longstanding public health guidance. The concern lies not in what is included, but I think more the serving targets, as Chantal, you've already mentioned. The guidelines recommend 3 servings of vegetables, 2 of fruit for a 2,000 calorie dietary pattern. The document doesn't really clearly define what constitutes a serving. If we apply the standard public health convention of a serving is roughly a half a cup or 1 cup of leafy greens, this amounts to about 2.5 cups total daily. That is significantly lower than the previous US recommendations, which translated to roughly 4.5 to 5 cups per day for vegetables and fruits, which would be 9 to 10 servings. It's also lower than guidance from other national food policies like Canada's food guide, which emphasizes that at least half the plate should be vegetables and fruits at most meals. And of course, large meta-analyses suggest that chronic disease risk continues to decline with intakes closer to 5 servings of vegetables and 4 servings of fruits, or at least 800 grams in total. So as a minimum. And those levels, consistently are associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and all-cause mortality. We do need to recognize that 3 servings of vegetables and 2 of fruits represents an improvement for many Americans. It definitely does not reflect the level of intake associated with optimal health outcomes. So if you have anything to add in the fruit and vegetable section, Chantal?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Number 2 is incorporate healthy fats. And there are 3 bullets here. And the first bullet reads, healthy fats are plentiful in many whole foods, such as meats, poultry, eggs, omega-3 rich seafood, nuts, seeds, full-fat dairy, olives, and avocados. And this is really interesting. I mean, the guideline basically blends foods that are predominantly unsaturated fat, that provide predominantly unsaturated fat, like nuts and seeds and olives and avocados and even seafood, with foods that are major contributors to saturated fat in the American diet, like full-fat dairy and fatty meats. From a cardiometabolic standpoint, the grouping is pretty imprecise, and the strongest evidence distinguishes between fat types. Unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats, are very consistently associated with reduced risk of especially cardiovascular disease when they replace saturated fats. And saturated fats, by contrast, raise LDL, which is a cholesterol, and which is a causal risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Lumping all of these foods together under healthy fats really obscures the important differences in fatty acid composition and health outcomes. I don't see meat, poultry, eggs having any place in a bullet about incorporating healthy fats. It just doesn't make sense to me. And then bullet 2, when cooking or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids such as olive oil. Other options can include butter or beef tallow.
Oh my.
So yeah, so this is just unbelievable. So the guidance is problematic for 2 reasons. First, olive oil is described as a source of essential fatty acids. Well, olive oil is a healthful oil rich in monounsaturated fat. It's really not a major source of essential fatty acids. It contains very modest amounts of linoleic acid, very small amounts of alpha-linolenic acid. Its primary fat is oleic acid, which is beneficial, but not necessarily essential. And if the intent is to promote essential fatty acid intake, why didn't they mention oils higher in alpha-linolenic acid, like flaxseed, walnut, or even canola oil? Those would be more accurate examples of fats with omega-3s. And then the second problem is presenting butter and beef tallow as comparable options alongside olive oil. I think this just creates confusion because they're mainly saturated. They're extremely high in saturated fat, and they contradict the long-standing recommendation to limit saturated fat. It's just we see in low carb carnivore type communities the recommendations for butter and beef tallow. We do not see those recommendations from credible scientists, that's for sure. No. And then the final recommendation is in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of total daily calories. Significantly limiting highly processed foods will help to meet this goal. More high-quality research is needed to determine what types of dietary fats best support long-term health. Again, gobsmacked. I cannot believe that this would be a guideline in the guidelines for dietary guidelines for Americans. Well, the guidance mentioned, they maintain the long-standing recommendation to limit saturated fat to less than 10% of calories. They simultaneously encourage the intake of full-fat dairy, butter, beef tallow, and meat, all of which are the biggest sources of saturated fat in the American diet. They provide at least 70% of the saturated fat consumed. The contradiction is so striking, and it's so inconsistent with decades of cardiometabolic research. High saturated fat intake is linked to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly when saturated fats are replaced with, or when replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. That's where we reduce risk. We need to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated. And the guidance tells consumers to reduce saturated fat by limiting what? Not meat and dairy, but highly processed foods.
Which
And,
not many
yeah,
contain saturated fats.
yeah, but these foods can contribute to total saturated fat intake when they contain, lard and some, when we tried to get rid of trans fats, we replaced them with more saturated fats like lard. But their total contribution is probably not more than 20% of saturated fat in the diet. So, promoting these saturated fat rich foods alongside a saturated fat limit is just confusing. It's at a policy level, it's so inconsistent. And the bottom line is this section of the new guidelines is, on fat is not aligned with current scientific consensus. It blurs the line between nutrient dense and saturated fat rich foods. It misleads the public on what constitutes a meaningful source of essential fatty acids, and it actually contradicts the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's conclusion, which emphasizes limiting saturated fats and increasing unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats from plant foods. So I love your input on page 2 and on part 2, which is the whole section on fats.
I don't think I can even say anything. I mean, what do you say to the fact that they just contradicted their own guidelines with that 10%?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you say?
What do you say? Exactly. Unbelievable. And then, getting to the bottom of page 2 is part 3, which is titled Focus on Whole Grains. And there are 3 bullets here. Bullet 1, prioritize fiber-rich whole grains. Bullet 2, significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed refined carbohydrates, such as white bread, ready-to-eat cereal, or packaged breakfast options, flour tortillas, and crackers. Bullet 3, whole grain serving goals are 2 to 4 servings a day, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. And I think the whole grain section is on the surface one of the more sort of reasonable parts of the guidelines because it encourages fiber-rich whole grains and suggests reducing highly processed refined carbohydrates. And this really aligns with the decades of evidence we have. So there's no major disagreement there. I think the issue arises with the numeric target 2 to 4 servings per day. The guidelines don't clearly define what constitutes a serving, and if interpreted as roughly half a cup equivalent, consistent with sort of our public health standard, it could represent a lower visible target than prior guidance has. And I don't think people necessarily need more than 2 to 4 servings a day, but some people will need more than that if they have high caloric requirements. And to be fair, they did say, adjusting according to requirements. But, when we look at research, the previous guidelines basically said total grain intake with at least half whole grain should be 3 to 5 serving equivalents or more per day, depending on caloric needs. But many cardiometabolic outcome studies show benefits continue at intakes of roughly 3 or more servings per day. This is about 48 grams of whole grains. And with providing significant reductions in cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes risk. Now, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee emphasized whole grains within broader plant-forward dietary patterns like Mediterranean and DASH-style diets, where higher fiber intake is sort of a defining feature. And the new guidelines present a very much narrower numeric target without sort of the broader dietary pattern context. But it's worth noting that the list of refined grains includes, white bread, packaged cereals, flour tortillas, and crackers, which certainly can be very highly processed, but not all refined grains are equal. And I think context matters. Refined grains that are consumed within balanced dietary patterns, like a Mediterranean diet, are not necessarily metabolically identical to ultra-processed snack foods. And I mentioned that before, and I think we need to recognize that. But beyond wording of this section, which is reasonable in many respects, visual placement on the guide, on the pyramid, matters. And in the pyramid, hierarchy signals priority, and whole grains appear very visually de-emphasized, positioned lower than foods such as butter and red meat, with a black line between the foods that are higher on the pyramid and grains. It subtly reshapes how the public interpret what is foundational versus optional. So the concern is not whether whole grains are explicitly discouraged, but it's both the numeric framing and the visual hierarchy, to me, that sort of underemphasizes the potential benefits for gut health and chronic disease reduction that we see when people do consume healthy, intact whole grains. So that's page 2. Chantal, any further comments about the whole grains section?
Yeah, if I can just add, my input would be there is nuisance that is missing as always when it comes to processed foods, because we know that the terminology is not necessarily defining what we're looking for. For example, most people will buy oat groats, and actually the cat steel oats. Okay, and even if you buy groats, the thing is, it is already a process because it's been taken from the plant and deshelled and then put, so that we can eat it, and you have to prepare them. Flour tortilla. Flour. What kind of flour are we talking about? Are we talking like there's a difference between Doritos and the likes to a whole grain flour tortilla, maybe from like the Ezekiel bread company, that makes them with the sprouted grains. Like there are such nuisances here that we have to look at, and here they just lump everything in one part, and people are confused about what is a processed food in the sense that it's been already processed so we can consume it, versus something that is hyper processed, made palatable with chemicals that ingredients we can't get and use in our kitchens. That's where the nuisance comes in, I think, is missing.
Yes, exactly. And so thank you for that addition. That's really important. Now, moving on to page 3. Page 3, part 1, there's basically 2 parts. So, it's all one, but there's a pop-out box at the bottom on sugars. So this it's basically about refined carbohydrates and sugars. And so it says limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. And there are 5 bullets in the section. And bullet 1 is to avoid highly processed foods, prepared, ready to eat, or other foods that are salty or sweet, such as chips, cookie, and candy that have added sugars and sodium. Instead, prioritize nutrient-dense foods and home-prepared meals. When dining out, choose nutrient-dense options. Bullet 2, limit foods and beverages that include artificial colors, petroleum-based dyes, artificial preservatives, and low-calorie, non-nutritive sweeteners. Bullet 3, avoid high sugar-sweetened beverages, such as sodas, fruit drinks, and energy drinks. Bullet 4, while no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet, one meal should contain no more than 10 grams of added sugars. And then bullet 5 is when selecting snack foods, added sugars added sugar limits should follow FDA healthy claim limits. For example, grain snacks like crackers should not exceed 5 grams of added sugar per 3/4 ounce whole grain equivalent, and dairy snacks like yogurt should not exceed 2.5 grams of added sugar per 2,000 cup equivalent. So, this section takes a pretty firm stance on highly processed foods, added sugars, and non-nutritive sweeteners, and much of it aligns with existing science, I would say. Diets that are high in added sugars, especially sugar-sweetened beverages, are associated with an increased risk of numerous diseases, weight gain, poor metabolic health in general. So the general message to significantly reduce added sugars and ultra-processed foods, nutrient-poor foods, is entirely consistent with the evidence. I think where the language becomes more absolute is the statement that no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended as or considered part of a healthy diet. And to me, the framing moves beyond what most scientific bodies would describe as risks. So leading authorities, if you look at the World Health Organization, the American Heart Association, and prior US dietary guidelines, they tend to recommend added sugars, to keep added sugars to less than 10% of total calories. And that's about 50 grams in a 2,000 calorie diet. Some recommend lower targets, especially the American Heart Association. And I think, I personally think a lower target of 5% would be better. So about 25 grams a day or not more than 6 teaspoons a day. The framework basically acknowledges that risk increases with higher intakes, but small amounts, I think, can fit into an overall nutrient-dense dietary patterns. I think moderate intakes of added sugars within sort of those recommended limits aren't consistently associated to adverse health outcome when diet quality is high. So the evidence from for harm comes from higher intakes, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages and highly processed snack foods. So, for non-nutritive sweeteners, the evidence is not great, but it's more mixed. They may help to reduce caloric intake in the short term for some individuals. Long-term data is still evolving. I think people should largely avoid them, but small occasional amounts probably could be okay if they're well chosen, monk fruit or something like that. And so here I think that, framing matters. Nutrition science operates on a continuum of risk and not on the premise that trace amounts are inherently toxic. And saying no amount, I think, unintentionally shifts the conversation from dose-dependent risk to moralizing messaging. For most people, sustainable dietary patterns do include occasional sweets, cultural foods that contain modest added sugars, or social occasions like a birthday, where dessert is part of the celebration. I think is absolutely fine, and I think public health guidance should aim to reduce excess without creating unnecessary rigidity. I think keeping added sugars, I would like to see them below 5%. Is supported by pretty strong evidence, but very small amounts of added sugar within these recommended limits in a high quality dietary pattern are not inherently incompatible with good health. So, and then the last part of this page is about identifying sugars and other sweeteners on food labels. And it's largely practical and consumer focused and teaches people to identify sugar on labels. To me, the clarification that naturally occurring sugars in fruit and plain milk are not considered added sugars is accurate and important. But the list of non-nutritive sweeteners there is not exhaustive. They omit stevia and monk fruit, but it's just an omission. It's not a major scientific error. So that's pretty much all I have to say for page 3. If you have anything to add, Chantal.
No, and I appreciate that they actually, in the third part, they say that some foods and drinks, such as plant-based milks, have naturally occurring sugars, and those are not considered added. So that's good.
Yeah, yeah. And then, so let's move on. Page 4 is a short page on alcohol and sodium. And so for alcohol, there's 2 bullets. They say consume less alcohol for better overall health. Bullet 2 says people should completely avoid alcohol, or people who should completely avoid alcohol include pregnant women, people who are recovering from alcohol use disorder, or are unable to control the amount they drink, and people taking medications or with medical conditions that can interact with alcohol. For those with a family history of alcoholism, be mindful of alcohol consumption and associated addictive behaviors. And I think the alcohol section is pretty broadly consistent with long-standing public health messaging about alcohol. I think encouraging reduction and clearly stating that certain populations should avoid it is entirely evidence-based and appropriate. To me, the only issue here is the absence of very specific intake guidance that could leave consumers without really clear understanding of what moderation means in practical terms. So I would have liked it to be framed in terms of how much is safe to consume. In Canada, we have fairly unique guidelines in that regard. And we very clearly state no amount of alcohol is really safe in terms of health outcomes. And then part 2 is on sodium, and they have 3 bullets here. The first bullet saying sodium and electrolytes are essential for hydration. The general population, ages 14 and above, should consume less than 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium. Highly active individuals may benefit from increased sodium intake to offset sweat losses. Bullet 2 for children, the recommendations vary by age. Ages 1 to 3, less than 1,200, 4 to 8, less than 1,500, and ages 9 to 13, less than 1,800 per day. Bullet 3 is highly processed foods that are high in sodium should be avoided. And so the sodium section, I think, is generally aligned with established chronic disease risk reduction guidelines. So we have this thing called the CDRR, which is the chronic disease risk reduction guidance. And the recommendation for adults to consume less than 2,300 milligrams per day reflects the CDRR framework, and again is consistent with longstanding public health guidelines. I think there are just 2 points I would make here. The first, that the statement that highly processed foods rich in sodium should be avoided is probably stronger than necessary, because from a practical standpoint, most people consume some processed foods, and public health messaging is often more effective when it emphasizes minimizing rather than eliminating. The evidence supports reducing sodium intake, especially from packaged and restaurant foods, but complete avoidance, I think, is neither realistic nor required to achieve meaningful reductions in sodium intake. And the second is it would have been really helpful to acknowledge that certain populations, including people with hypertension, cardiovascular disease, chronic disease, Black adults and older adults may benefit from intakes closer to not more than 1,500 milligrams per day. I think 2,300 is okay for our general population target. Risk reduction continues at lower intakes in these sort of high risk groups. So that's all I would say there. And if you have any further additions to the alcohol or sodium sections, that would be great.
No, I agree with you on what you shared, and I don't think there's much to add.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So then we have 3 pages left. We move on to page 5, which is infancy and childhood. And they're talking here birth to 4 years. And there's actually 5 bullets. The first being, for the first 6 months of life, feed your baby only breast milk. When breast milk is not available, feed your baby iron fortified infant formula. No argument there. Bullet 2, continue breastfeeding as long as mutually desired by mother and child for 2 years or beyond. If feeding or supplementing your baby with infant formula, stop feeding your baby infant formula at 12 months and give them whole milk. And this can be done. And so that's, I think I somehow, let's see. Yeah, and that's it. And then bullet 3 is all breastfed infants, as well as infants who consume less than 32 ounces of infant formula per day, should receive a daily vitamin D supplement of 400 IUs. Consult healthcare professionals about vitamin D supplementation. Bullet 4, some infants require iron supplementation. Talk to your healthcare professional about iron supplementation. Bullet 5, at about 6 months, infants may begin to have solid foods. It's crucial to continue breastfeeding or formula feeding while solids are introduced. Breast milk or infant formula continue to be the main source of nutrition for your infant up to 12 months of age. And then if your infant is at high risk for peanut allergy, talk to your healthcare professional about peanut introduction as early as 4 to 6 months. This can be done by mixing a small amount of peanut butter with breast milk or formula, thinning to a safe consistency. For infants with mild to moderate eczema, introduce peanut-containing foods around 6 months of age. And then the sixth bullet is to introduce potentially allergenic foods, including nut butters, eggs, shellfish, and wheat, with other complementary foods at about 6 months. Ask your infant's healthcare professional about risk of food allergies and safe way to introduce them. And then the next bullet is infants should receive a diverse range of nutrient-dense foods in appropriate textures while avoiding nutrient-poor and highly processed foods. And then examples of nutrient-dense foods to introduce during the complementary feeding period include: first, meat, poultry, and seafood; second, vegetables and fruits; full-fat yogurt, or third, full-fat yogurt and cheese; fourth, whole grains; and fifth, legumes and nut or seed-containing foods prepared in a safe and infant-appropriate form. And then the last bullet is avoid added sugars during infancy and childhood. So that's a lot of bullets. I think this section contains a lot of well-supported recommendations: exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, continued breastfeeding until as mutually desired, appropriate timing of solid food introduction, vitamin D supplementation, early peanut introduction, all the guidelines for, potentially allergenic foods. They all align with high quality evidence and represent solid public health guidance. But for me, the problem area, as I'm sure it is for you, Chantal, is the prominent placement of meat, poultry, and seafood as the first examples of nutrient-dense complementary foods. Meat is emphasized to ensure adequate iron, which is, super important for infants. Iron deficiency is really needs to be avoided in infancy because it can affect long-term cognition. However, what a lot of people don't realize, and I think what they didn't realize, is that in our country, in Canada and the United States, the RDA for infants for iron is 11 milligrams a day. And getting 11 milligrams of iron from baby beef, you would need to eat 55 to 70 tablespoons of baby beef a day. And I think I mentioned this in the last podcast we did, but that's 3.5 to 4.5 cups. It's just an amount that is, not even a possibility for an infant. It's not realistic. And on the other hand, 6 to 8 tablespoons of iron fortified infant cereal provides that 11 milligrams, which is a very reasonable amount. A much more practical way of making sure infants get enough iron. And, the other thing I think we need to think about is early food exposure really shapes taste preferences and dietary patterns that often track into later childhood and adulthood. So establishing familiarity with a very diverse range of plant foods, including legumes, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, can help to build protective dietary patterns for children. If families do choose to include meat, it can contribute iron and zinc, but it doesn't have to be the default or the primary complementary food. It would make so much more sense to lead with iron fortified cereals, legumes, vegetables, fruits, And if meat is included at the bottom, and legumes, including tofu, are wonderful first foods for infants. So that's my comment there. And Chantel, if you have anything to add, that would be great.
There is just one point, like using the formula up to 12 months and then move to whole milk.
Oh, yes.
So I don't see why would you move to whole milk. Like you can use formula longer, depending on how your child is developing into eating solid food, or if you're still breastfeeding. I personally don't think whole milk should substitute a formula or should be, highlighted as something that kids need to have. But that I know that that's what
So
it is now, but
yeah, and typically even the American Academy of Pediatrics or the American Pediatric Society, it's the Canadian Pediatric Society and the American Academy of Pediatrics, I believe. But in the US, I mean, it is very standard to say that formula is required for only 12 months. And after that, babies can go on to full fat or whole milk. But I think what's missing here is the alternatives to whole milk.
yeah,
And which are full fat fortified soy milk is a certainly reasonable and healthy alternative for children. In fact, it may help to reduce lifetime risk of breast cancer and so forth. So I think that was an important omission. And they did say breast milk, breastfeed to 2 years and beyond, which I think is just so important. We want to breastfeed infants as long as possible. So
but that was good. That was good.
so so we're nearing the end. We've got 2 pages left, and so the page 6 is all about introducing foods to infants and toddlers, plus middle childhood and adolescents. And so part 1 is introducing food to infant and toddlers. There's just 2 bullets here. The first being every child is different. Look for these signs that your child is developmentally ready to begin eating food. And it's all of the things we would suggest: sitting up alone and grasping small objects and all of that. And then it says opens their mouth when food is offered, moves, all of that, which is just fine. Then bullet 2 is parents and caregivers can encourage healthy eating by offering new foods multiple times. It may take 8 or 10 exposures before a young child is willing to try new food. All of this advice is consistent with current guidelines and is really quite reasonable. And then we move on to middle childhood. So that's ages 5 to 10 years. And we've got 5 bullets here. First is bullet 1 is focus on whole nutrient dense foods such as protein foods, dairy, vegetables, fruits, healthy fats, and whole grains. Bullet 2, full fat dairy products are important for children to help meet energy needs for brain development. Bullet 3, avoid caffeinated beverages. Bullet 4, no amount of added sugars is recommended. And bullet 5, make cooking meals fun and a regular part of the household's routine. And so and then we have adolescence after that. But let's talk about the middle childhood recommendations. So it includes a lot of solid messages, encouraging whole nutrient dense foods, avoiding caffeinated beverages, limiting ultra processed foods, making cooking a regular family activity. I love that. So these are pretty practical and well supported recommendations. I think where the framing becomes problematic is in the emphasis of full fat dairy and animal-based protein without clearly acknowledging our plant-based options. I mean, it's definitely true. Children need adequate energy and fat and protein and calcium and all the other nutrients necessary to support growth and development. But those needs can be met through a lot of different dietary patterns, and legumes, tofu, fortified plant milks, nut and seed butters, whole grains, and leafy greens certainly can provide very high quality nutrition when thoughtfully included. And presenting dairy and animal protein as central without explicitly mentioning these equivalents signals that alternative patterns are secondary when in fact they can be very fully adequate. And saying full-fat dairy products are important for children to help meet energy needs, it's just not an overstatement, but it's making it sound like children absolutely, it's essential that they must have it, when of course it's not. And then the other thing that I think, the statement that no amount of added sugar is recommended, I mean, it doesn't reflect real world childhood experiences. Most children will have a piece of cake at a birthday party or a chocolate bunny at Easter or whatever. I think a more constructive approach would be to emphasize limiting added sugars, especially from sugar sweetened beverages and packaged snacks, while allowing occasional treats within an overall nutrient dense dietary patterns. I think sustainable habits are built really through consistency, not necessarily being completely perfect in everything you do. And there's also, I think, an opportunity for greater inclusivity. A lot of families follow culturally diverse or plant-based dietary patterns, and explicitly acknowledging that children can thrive on a variety of patterns, including plant-forward ones, would strengthen the guidance and reflect, better the diversity of American households. Anything to add there, Chantal?
No, I was going to talk about the dairy, but you mentioned it, so.
Yeah. And then part three is adolescence, and they are referring to children age 11 to 18 in this, rather than 13 to 18. But that's just a slight variation from, I think, the RDA. There are 3 bullets here. Number 1 being adolescence is a rapid growth period with increased needs for energy, protein, calcium, and iron, especially for girls due to menstruation. Adequate calcium and vitamin D are vital for peak bone mass. Bullet 2, adolescents should eat nutrient-dense foods such as dairy, leafy greens, and iron-rich animal foods, while significantly limiting sugary drinks and energy drinks and avoiding highly processed foods. When access to nutrient-rich foods is limited, fortified foods or supplements may be needed under medical guidance. And bullets 3, encourage adolescents to become active participants in food shopping and cooking so they learn how to make healthy choices for life. So I don't think there's anything we disagree with bullets 1 and 3. They're appropriate. It's appropriate to highlight it's a period of growth, increased nutrient needs. It's a critical window for skeletal development. The guidance to limit sugary beverages and energy drinks, I think, is very well supported, particularly given concerns about metabolic and dental health, and then encouraging teens to participate in food shopping. Great. But where the guidance is a little debatable is in how nutrient-dense foods are framed. The examples are, they basically highlight dairy and iron-rich animal foods, which certainly can contribute nutrients, but iron and calcium needs can be easily met through plant-based sources like legumes, tofu, fortified cereals, fortified plant-based milks, nuts, seeds, leafy greens, all of that. And explicitly acknowledging plant-forward options would make, guidance more inclusive and more reflective, again, of diverse populations. And then in addition, I think the recommendation to avoid all highly processed foods is more restrictive than is warranted. I mean, even plant-based milks are lumped into, highly processed foods. They can provide very important nutrition at all stages of life. So there's strong evidence linking dietary patterns high in sugar sweetened beverages, packaged dessert, processed meat, all of that with adverse health outcomes. But the category of ultra processed foods is really broad, and some of them are very helpful in meeting nutritional requirements. And so in adolescence, where independence and schedules become very complex, we have to be practical, and improving overall diet quality is more effective than categorically avoiding completely all processed foods. So that's my comments in that section. Anything to add, Chantal?
I agree with you. And I just see that bias, like iron from animal products and
Mm-hmm.
no mention of, and this is something we need to think about. We don't talk about cardiovascular health in something that we should look at from when we are young. So even the input and the effect of heme iron versus non-heme iron, which we can get a lot of in plants, especially as we eat high vitamin C products, food, fruit and vegetables. Like this is missing nuisance again. But I think we know that there's a bias here, and in the next points we actually see it fully played out. So yeah.
Yeah, and excellent comments. Yeah, it's just you can see that the bias comes through in so many parts of these guidelines. It's just very, very visible. And so now we have 2 pages left. The next page covers 4 groups: young adults, pregnant women, lactating women, and older adults. And part 1 is young adulthood, and in young adulthood, there's just one bullet, and it says following dietary guidelines will support optimal health during this period, including reducing risk of the onset and progression of chronic disease and supporting other aspects of health. The brain continues to mature during young adulthood. While most significant increases in bone density occur during adolescence, optimizing bone health to achieve peak bone mass and peak bone strength is essential. Additionally, following the dietary guidelines can support reproductive health for both women and men, with special emphasis on healthy fats, iron and folate for women, and healthy fats and protein for men. And here I think it's, the section appropriately emphasizes brain maturation, bone mass, and reproductive health. But highlighting iron and folate for women is appropriate as well, given the demands of menstruation and potential pregnancy, and emphasizing healthy fats is appropriate. But it's somewhat curious to me that protein is specifically emphasized for men, but not women. Women also require adequate protein during young adulthood for bone health, muscle maintenance, reproductive health, and overall metabolic function. And protein needs are not gender exclusive. I found that very strange. A more balanced framing would acknowledge that both men and women benefit from sufficient protein intake alongside adequate micronutrients during this stage of life. So that was really the only thing that came to mind there. Anything for you, Chantal?
I mean, the whole point of following the dietary guidelines when we have been actually showing where they fall short.
Yes.
It's really sad because no, we are not preventing any chronic disease with this
No.
guideline. In fact,
Yeah.
we're accentuating it. So I really feel sorry for anybody that will take this and think that this is going to really set them up for a healthy longevity and vitality filled life. Yeah, it's so unscientific to even say this when that guidelines just don't did the
So, yeah.
opposite.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's a very important point. Thank you. And then part 2 is looking specifically at pregnant women, and there are 3 bullets here. Pregnancy increases nutrient needs to support maternal health and fetal growth, with iron, folate, and iodine as top priorities. Bullet 2: pregnant women should consume diverse nutrient-rich foods, including iron-rich meats, folate-rich greens and legumes, choline-rich eggs, calcium-rich dairy, and low-mercury omega-3 rich seafoods like salmon, sardine, and trout. And then bullet 3: women should talk to their healthcare professional about daily prenatal vitamins during pregnancy. And I think, again, the section appropriately emphasizes nutrient needs to support maternal health and fetal development, and highlighting iron, folate, and iron as top priorities are pretty much aligned with evidence. The recommendation to discuss prenatal, vitamins with the professional is good. Supplementation during pregnancy is pretty much standard of care. But the parts that I had issue with, of course, are the examples, again, of nutrient-dense foods, including iron-rich meat, choline-rich eggs, calcium-rich dairy, omega-3 rich seafood. They're not the only ways to meet pregnancy requirements. Iron can be obtained, of course, from legumes and tofu and fortified cereals, especially when paired, as you mentioned earlier, Chantal, with vitamin C rich foods to enhance their absorption. Folate is abundant in leafy greens and legumes, and iodine from iodized salt or fortified foods. Choline is pretty high in a lot of soy foods and legumes, though supplementation, I think, is appropriate in many cases. Calcium needs can be met through, tofu and greens and fortified plant milks, and omega-3s can be supported with, a microalgae-based DHA supplement. So they make it sound as though, pregnant women should consume iron-rich meats. They should consume calcium-rich dairy, and they should consume seafood, which is just a huge overreach.
Yeah.
And so much omitted. So anything to add there, Chantal?
No, I was having, for me, it was the same comment, like giving these, examples of food, choline-rich eggs, when choline-rich food, and then listing also the plants, cruciferous vegetables.
Yes,
tofu, quinoa.
exactly.
Yeah.
So again, just showing an awful lot of bias there. Part 3 is on lactation. There's just 2 bullets. The first being lactation increases energy and nutrient needs to support milk production and maternal health. Breastfeeding women should consume a wide variety of nutrient-dense foods, including B12-rich protein sources such as meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy, omega-3 rich seafood, folate-rich legumes, and vitamin A-rich vegetables. Bullet 2 is women should talk to their healthcare professional about whether dairy supplements may be needed while breastfeeding. And so it, emphasizes this section: energy and nutrient needs increase, milk production requires additional nutrients. But again, it's the examples are where the problem lies. It's important to clarify that B12 is not exclusive to animal foods. It can be obtained through fortified foods and supplements, and adequate B12 is critical. But I think supplements are a much more reliable source even than animal products. And again, well, seafood does provide preformed DHA. So does microalgae supplement, which can be an option, and so it, and then dairy and eggs, and it just again makes it, should consume meat, should consume poultry, should consume eggs and dairy. It just makes it so not inclusive. And, the overarching principle during lactation is nutrient adequacy and adequate planning. And so many patterns can provide that when they're properly planned. And I think we just need to increase inclusivity and in these kinds of guidelines. We need to remember that there are lots of different cultures in this community.
Yeah. I think for me also, they did mention in the pregnancy the low mercury omega-3, but the definition, salmon, depending where it comes from and so on, there is not just the mercury and other heavy metals, but like we're also thinking microplastics here. And so even lactating women that that's the best way to get your long chain fatty acids, when we could do clean supplementation then, and avoid the microplastics on top of the heavy metals, makes much more sense to me, especially for children who are getting their food from their mom and are developing their brain and other organs. So I would have.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, because there are many more contaminants other than mercury, and microplastics are important. Persistent organic pollutants are important. PCBs, DDT, dioxins, all of those things that tend to move up the food chain and tend to be very high in seafood. So these are all very important considerations. I'm glad you brought that up, Chantal.
Mhm.
And then the last part of page 7 is on older adults. And there's just one bullet here. It says some older adults need fewer calories, but still require equal or greater amounts of key nutrients such as protein, B12, vitamin D, and calcium. And to meet these needs, they should prioritize nutrient-dense foods such as dairy, meats, seafood, eggs, legumes, and whole plant foods, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. When dairy intake or absorption is when dietary intake, or absorption is insufficient, fortified foods or supplements may be needed under medical supervision. And again, the problem here is we're telling people that they should prioritize dairy, meat, seafood, eggs, like right in the onset. Those are the first 4 mentioned foods. And I think they're right in saying that there's an important reminder that while caloric needs may decline, nutrient needs can even increase. And I think that's accurate. And I think prioritizing nutrient-dense foods is really key. But the default list, of course, is so animal-centered. And older adults can meet needs for these nutrients with a foundation of whole plant foods, fortified products, supplements where needed. And there's emerging evidence that plant-forward dietary patterns in older adulthood support cardiometabolic health, reduce systemic inflammation, and promote longevity. And in fact, there are studies that look at frailty and sarcopenia, showing that people are actually better off when their protein comes from plants compared to animals. And there are a couple of studies that were very powerful in this regard. And there have been plenty of studies. There was a brand new 2025 study that just compared people getting protein from plants versus animal products, and no difference even in muscle protein synthesis with the 2 types. So why not promote protein that reduces disease risk rather than promoting protein that may increase disease risk?
Exactly. And let's plug in the fact that you are releasing a book that is especially aimed at the aging population and how to meet all their required nutrients intakes so that they can thrive and age gracefully. And I think that's really important because you looked at so many studies with your co-authors to make sure that the book would be like the others that you have, of course, Bibles for getting references and understanding what the science says rather than, again, the influence of space online.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you think about, plant versus animal protein and risk of things like frailty, there was actually a study from 2022 that was a Harvard study that, using the Nurses' Health Study cohort, they actually showed that frailty was reduced 14% with the highest quintile of plant protein intake, and it was increased 7% with the highest intake of animal protein. Or the highest quintile of animal protein intake. And they found replacing 5% of energy from animal protein with plant protein reduced risk. If the protein was from meat, reduced frailty risk 42%. And if it was from dairy, reduced risk 32%. So, we see this, and we see it with sarcopenia as well. I found really, really surprising looking at some of the studies on sarcopenia, where they found that risk was reduced with plant protein versus animal protein. There was a study from Taiwan that found higher protein intakes were reduced with lower sarcopenia risk, but vegetable protein intake was much more strongly associated with reduced risk of low muscle mass than animal protein. And those with the lowest vegetable protein intake had over double the risk. I think it was 2.3 times the risk compared to others. And then there was another big study that showed that substitution of animal-based protein with plant-based protein reduced sarcopenia risk score across all levels of protein intake. And higher plant protein intakes were related to faster walking speed, higher scores for physical performance, all of that. So, for the dietary guidelines to just really push animal protein sources for older adults really ignores a lot of our evidence.
Yeah, exactly. It does. And I think,
and then we're on the very last page, and the very last page may be the most disturbing of all.
yeah, it's like the next one, brace yourself.
The last page covers chronic disease and vegetarians and vegans. And so the first part is on chronic disease. And there are two bullets. The first bullet says, following the dietary guidelines can help to prevent the onset or slow the rate of progression of chronic disease, especially cardiovascular disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. If you have a chronic disease, talk with your healthcare professional to see if you need to adapt the dietary guidelines to meet your specific needs. And bullet number 2, individuals with certain chronic disease may experience improved health outcomes when following a lower carbohydrate diet. Work with your healthcare professional to identify and adopt a diet that is appropriate for you and your health condition.
Yeah.
So, just beyond disappointing. I mean, it begins by saying that following the dietary guidelines can help slow the progression of these diseases. But I question whether meat and butter, that so prominently feature in the guidelines, are really the answer to slowing progression of cardiovascular disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And then they suggest the guidelines that individuals with certain chronic diseases may improve outcomes with a low carbohydrate diet. And while it's true that carbohydrate restricted diets may improve glycemic control in some people, in the short term anyway, the broader body of evidence really doesn't support carbohydrate restriction as a superior approach to chronic disease management. We have a lot of large prospective cohort studies and randomized controlled trials that very consistently demonstrate that dietary patterns rich in high carbohydrate, minimally processed plant foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. When you think about it, these foods, other than nuts and seeds, contain about 60 to 90% of calories from carbohydrates on average. So they're carbohydrate dominant foods. Nuts and seeds are lower because they are predominantly fat in terms of their macronutrient profile. But these are associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and certain cancers. And these protective patterns are naturally rich in fiber and unrefined carbohydrates. So cardiometabolic risk is really about carbohydrate quality rather than carbohydrate quantity. And I think their guidance really reinforces the misconception that carbohydrates themselves are the primary driver of chronic disease. The evidence suggests that, it's about dietary pattern and it's about carbohydrate quality. So for disease prevention and management, there are a number of dietary approaches that can be effective, but all of them emphasize mostly whole, minimally processed plant foods. And so, we see this over and over again in the scientific literature. Those are the dietary patterns that are most effective. And this guideline just completely ignores that evidence. Anything to add there, Chantal?
No, my comment would be the same as for adults, right? Like preventing following these dietary guidelines when we have already established that these dietary guidelines are actually not conducive to overall optimal health.
Yeah, exactly. And then we are at the very end of this discussion. Part 2 of page 8 is called Vegetarians and Vegans. And there are 4 bullets here. And this, I'm sure you feel the same, Chantel. This section just makes my blood boil. I just cannot believe the lack of integrity in this section. But bullet number 1 is to consume a variety of whole foods, especially protein-rich foods such as dairy, eggs, beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, tofu, or tempeh. Bullet 2, and I may as well just say right off the bat, we're talking about vegetarians and vegans. And the first 2 foods they mentioned is dairy and eggs. Rather than putting them at the end to be more inclusive of vegans, it's the first 2 foods mentioned as whole foods. Bullet 2, significantly limit highly processed vegan or vegetarian foods that can include added fat, sugar, and salt. Okay. Bullet 3, pay careful attention to potential nutrition or nutrient gaps when consuming a vegetarian or vegan diet. Vegetarian diets can fall short on vitamins D and E, choline, iron, whereas vegan diets show broader shortfalls in vitamins A, D, E, B6, and B12, riboflavin, niacin, choline, calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and protein. Monitor nutrient status periodically, especially for iron, B12, vitamin D, calcium, and iodine. And bullet 4 is to avoid nutrition gaps, prioritize targeted supplementation, diversify plant protein sources for amino acid balance, and enhance mineral bioavailability through food preparation techniques. You just shake your head. I mean, this is definitely one of the more egregious parts of the guidelines, not because it advises attention to nutrition adequacy, which is appropriate, but because it presents this incredibly broad list of nutrition shortfalls for vegans without any context. It suggests that vegans might fall short of protein, calcium, iron, zinc, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, multiple V vitamins, choline, And so the sweeping, this sort of sweeping framing doesn't at all align with the strongest available observational and cohort data. Yeah. But I think it's really important to understand how these nutrient gaps were identified. So rather than relying on large cohort studies that compares actual nutrient intakes in vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores, the analysis relies heavily on dietary modeling, essentially removing animal products from standard dietary patterns and assessing what nutrients would be missing if optimal plant replacements were not consistently included. So the way that they modeled the diets were just, 2,000 calorie diets. They weren't just, they weren't just replacing animal products with air. They were replacing them with just more of the same of plant foods, but not with replacements that were appropriate or that real world vegans would actually consume. In place of meat, we tend to consume tofu and tempeh and beans and peas and lentils and even sometimes some veggie meats and these kinds of things. In place of dairy, we often have soy milk or some fortified non-dairy alternatives. So this is a huge error in their calculations. So when we look at large prospective cohorts like the Adventist Health Study 2 and EPIC Oxford, they paint a more nuanced picture. So these real world populations find that vegans consume more fiber, more magnesium, potassium, folate, vitamin C and E than omnivores. And they all very consistently demonstrate much higher overall diet quality scores than the omnivores in these studies, and even than the lacto-ovo vegetarians in these studies. the nutrients that have generally been flagged as requiring some attention or may have higher potential for shortfalls are B12, vitamin D, iodine in some areas, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Protein adequacy is average protein intakes are around 60, 70, 75 grams a day in most vegan diets when caloric needs are met. So does this mean that vegetarian and vegan diets are automatically adequate? No dietary pattern is automatically adequate. Ultra-processed vegan foods high in sodium, salt, and refined starch are not health promoting simply because they're plant-based. So thoughtful planning and in some cases targeted supplementation can be really helpful, like B12 supplements. However, presenting vegan diets as broadly prone to deficiencies across nearly every major nutrient category just overstates the evidence and discourages individuals from adopting patterns that are not only associated with lower risk of chronic disease and overall mortality, but are aligned with ecological and ethical considerations, dietary considerations. And I think that ignoring that is just really tragic. This entire section is just really, really poorly written and poorly researched and very sad in my view.
Very, especially when we know that even omnivores are actually deficient in things like iodine, that the animals are given B12 supplements, that vitamin
Yes.
D is a massive deficiency that most people have, even if when they eat animal products. So it's just very confusing. It's a blatant lie, the way that they exposed it, especially when some of these vitamins they mention as lacking are actually very highly present in plants.
Yeah, and vegan diets are much higher in several of the nutrients they mentioned than omnivorous diets. So I don't know. I feel like they just pulled this list out of nowhere. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. But it was really amazing to go through the whole document because I don't think many people have done it. Obviously, we have called the show Nutrition Unpacked for a reason. We're really unpacking it. I think it was necessary to actually show point by point what is missing. Yes, it takes a bit of time to go through this, but it's something that it will benefit people when they want to actually stand against those that love the nuisance-free conversations, because ultimately health is multifaceted. We are trying to educate people, and guidelines should have done that. The education, guidelines should be educational material, but they never are so. It seems they're very much about just telling you what to do. The rationale sometimes is left out, especially in the US. In this case, is definitely left out. As we mentioned last time, a 400 pages document became a 9 pages document. If you're not leaving things out, then I don't know. It's marketing, you know?
Yeah, and I think the bottom line is nutrition policy like this shapes the health of millions of people.
Yeah.
And not just for today, but for generations to come. And when national guidance drifts so far from established scientific consensus in chronic disease prevention, we don't just change messaging, we change risk for people. And I think public trust depends on transparency and scientific scrutiny. And when that trust is strained, it is our responsibility as clinicians and as scientists to examine, to question, and to demand better from our governments. And this is, a step in that direction.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brenda. This was really excellent. And I'm glad you had the chance to really take us through the whole document and the science behind what is true and what is not.
Oh, you're so very welcome. I just felt like that would be the best way of helping people to see where the shortfalls were and just to really see what, I mean, this is it. That was the whole document. We covered every single thing written in the document. So yeah, hopefully it's comprehensive and people got some good takeaways.
It definitely is. And I think with other conversations we're going to have, that everything, we also decided to start with the dietary guidelines because ultimately every conversation we will have about nutrition will be linked because of some statements that are made in this document. So when we are looking online, for example, the low-hanging fruit will be the carnivore diet. We know this document is very highly supportive of their lifestyle. So when we go and talk about the claims that they make, reality versus fiction, we will be able to unpack it and actually bring it back here so people are aware, because we want the general population not to fall for, again, propaganda, and rather actually look at the science and set themselves up for a long life of that can hopefully be disease free versus
Yes,
a diet that can actually add on to more chronic issues.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So thank you so much. And everybody,
Thanks,
I
Chantal.
really appreciated having you here, and give us some love into the comments, subscribe, and make sure that you tell us what you want to hear more about and what you see online, because we can unpack it for you. Bye.
Bye-bye.